General Hospital spoilers for Thursday, July 10th teased that Michael had never looked more composed, or more dangerous. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. But there was a chilling calm in the way he presented his terms, as if the decision had already been made long before the words left his mouth. He stood across from Willow, eyes fixed, voice measured, and laid everything out like it was a business negotiation. But this wasn't business. This was about Wiley. About Amelia. About the future of a fractured family that had long since stopped pretending everything was fine. He told Willow what he needed. Not what he wanted, what he expected. If she was serious about co-parenting, about keeping the children safe, about honoring the family they had once tried to build, then she would agree to his conditions. She would move back into the guest wing of the Quartermain estate. She would stop questioning his judgment when it came to the kids. And she would support the public image that they were still aligned as parents, even if privately everything between them had shattered into dust. It wasn't a request. It was control wrapped in civility. Willow stood frozen, every part of her fighting to hide the terror blooming in her chest. The man she once loved, the man she once believed would always protect her, was gone. In his place was someone colder. Calculated. Obsessed not with partnership, but with power. And it wasn't just about keeping the children safe anymore. It was about keeping her in check. About making sure he remained at the center of their lives, no matter the cost. Michael framed it as concern. That was the most insidious part. He said he didn't want the children to be confused by inconsistency. That Wiley needed stability. That Amelia deserved a routine. That after everything they'd been through, wasn't it better to find a middle ground, for the kids? But beneath the surface of his words, Willow could feel something else. A shadow. A pressure. An emotional trap disguised as fatherly duty. Every term he listed sounded reasonable on its own. But stacked together, they formed a prison. A life where she would never be free of his grip. A home she would never truly escape. A role she would be forced to play long after the curtain had fallen. And worst of all, Michael wasn't alone in his crusade. He had begun subtly drawing other people into the orbit of his plan. Family members. Lawyers. Mutual friends. Anyone who might add legitimacy to his claims. Anyone who might pressure Willow into believing she was overreacting, ungrateful, or even unstable. She's just overwhelmed, he'd said to Monica in passing. Maybe it's postpartum anxiety. He sowed seeds of doubt before she even realized he'd planted them. By the time she pushed back, the roots had already taken hold. Willow didn't want to fight. She wanted peace. She wanted to raise Wiley and Amelia without drama, without courts, without lawyers. But the more Michael tightened his grip, the more she realized she was no longer just navigating custody, she was surviving an obsession. One built not just on the fear of losing his children, but the fear of losing control. This was one of the new hauntings creeping through Port Charles, the kind that didn't announce itself with violence or scandal, but with emotional suffocation. And Willow was living it. Every day. Every night. Every forced smile in front of the kids. Every co-parenting conversation that felt more like a chess match. Every quiet moment where she wondered if she was imagining it all. Or if Michael was truly orchestrating her emotional captivity under the guise of family. She tried reaching out. To Carly. To Sam. To Diane. But none of them fully understood what she was trying to explain. Michael wasn't being cruel. He wasn't breaking the law. He was being reasonable. And that's what made it impossible. He weaponized reason. He cloaked his obsession in fatherhood. He made it look like love when really, it was possession. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, Willow still hoped he might change. That maybe the man she had once known still lived behind those cold, calculating eyes. That maybe he was just scared. That maybe, just maybe, if she played along long enough, things would settle. But the haunting wasn't going away. Every time she watched Michael hold Amelia too tightly, or give Wiley one of those forced, too perfect smiles. She felt it. The truth. This wasn't about what was best for the kids. This was about Michael's fear of being irrelevant. Of being out of control. Of being left behind. And that fear had turned him into someone Willow no longer recognized. Now, with the terms laid out and pressure mounting, Willow stood on the edge of a decision that would change everything. She could agree, and live in the illusion. Or she could fight, and risk losing everything. Either path was treacherous. Either path meant pain. But the longer she stayed silent, the clearer it became. This wasn't co-parenting. This was captivity. And the most terrifying part? No one else could see it. Only her. And the children. And the quiet, echoing dread that grew louder each day. Telling her that the haunting wasn't around the corner anymore. It was already here. Emma didn't expect the question to come out the way it did. But something in her chest had been tightening for weeks, and it finally snapped. She looked at Jocelyn, not with judgment. But with the kind of fear that only came from recognizing something dangerous disguised as romance, and asked, "What's going on with you and Vaughn?" It wasn't casual, and it wasn't subtle. It was the kind of question that pierced through every carefully placed excuse Jocelyn had built to shield herself from the truth. There was a pause. A silence so thick it felt like the room had lost all oxygen. Jocelyn didn't blink. She didn't breathe. Because she knew Emma wasn't just asking. She was seeing. Seeing through the smokescreen of smiles and vague replies. Seeing the obsession that had rooted itself in Jocelyn's life and was now spreading like ivy through every part of her being. Vaughn wasn't just a boyfriend anymore. He was an all-consuming presence, a force that had quietly taken control of her choices, her time, her identity. What had started as infatuation had evolved into something more dangerous, more suffocating, and Emma had sensed the shift long before Jocelyn could name it. There had been signs. The way Vaughn's texts came faster, more frequent, more demanding. The way Jocelyn stopped showing up to social events. The way she carefully crafted her stories to avoid triggering jealousy or interrogation. The way she always looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, like she was constantly calculating something invisible. And now, in the stillness after Emma's question, everything Jocelyn had suppressed was screaming beneath her skin. She wanted to say it wasn't what Emma thought. That Vaughn was just intense. That he loved her too much. But the excuses tasted like ash in her mouth, because she no longer believed them. What Emma was pointing to, what Jocelyn had refused to face, was that her relationship had become a prison. Vaughn wasn't keeping her with kindness, he was keeping her with fear, with guilt. With the addictive promise that no one else would ever love her this deeply. And the worst part was, Jocelyn had believed it. She had let herself believe that this firestorm was passion. That the volatility meant he cared. But deep down, she knew better. Vaughn's love came with conditions. With surveillance. With control. With a quiet erasure of who she used to be. And Emma's question, though simple, detonated that truth in her mind like a landmine. Suddenly, every late-night fight, every apology laced with manipulation, every moment of isolation made sense. This wasn't love. It was obsession. And not just his. Hers too. Her obsession with fixing him, proving herself, making it work even when everything in her gut told her to run. But now, with Emma watching her closely, with concern rather than condemnation, Jocelyn realized she didn't have to carry this alone. Someone saw the haunting. Someone saw the unraveling. Someone cared enough to say it out loud. And that, more than anything Vaughn had ever done, shook her to the core. Because if Emma could see it, maybe others could too. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could still reclaim herself from the shadow Vaughn had cast over her life. But even as that hope flickered, another part of her trembled. Because she knew Vaughn would sense the shift. He always did. He would feel her pulling away. And he would not let go quietly. The fire between them was no longer romantic, it was volatile. And Emma's question had just lit the next match. Drew had been searching for leverage for weeks, anything he could use to tip the scales back in his favor as the walls closed in around him. He was a man who once controlled the narrative. Who once stood with quiet confidence at the center of Port Charles's power grid. But now, with alliances crumbling and whispers turning into accusations, Drew was backed into a corner. He needed an edge. And Kai gave him exactly that. The moment Kai slid the folder across the table, Drew knew something significant had shifted. Inside were documents, surveillance images. And one damning recording, evidence suggesting that Curtis had secretly paid Jacinda to manipulate testimony during the early stages of the investigation surrounding the Deception financial scandal. It wasn't just a bribe. It was an act of desperation, one that could be framed as obstruction, perjury, or worse. For Drew, it was more than just scandalous. It was opportunity. A bombshell ready to be detonated. What made it more explosive was how deeply Jacinda had tried to disappear after the incident. Withdrawing from the case and vanishing from Port Charles entirely, until now. Kai had tracked her down, spoken to her off the record. And confirmed that Curtis had offered her money in exchange for clarifying certain statements that might have otherwise implicated Drew further in the misappropriation of funds linked to Deception and Sonny's blood money. Now, the narrative had turned. Curtis, who had positioned himself as a reformer, a truth seeker, a man above the murky politics of Port Charles, was suddenly exposed as someone willing to manipulate the system just as viciously as the men he claimed to be fighting. And Drew? Drew finally had leverage. With this information, he could pull the strings again. He could call out Curtis in public, expose the hypocrisy, and regain a foothold in the power games of the city. But it wasn't just strategy, it was personal. Drew had felt betrayed when Curtis aligned with Portia, when the courtroom turned on him, when Willow began doubting him. Now, with proof that Curtis had tainted the legal process, Drew could call everything into question, the credibility of the case, the motivations of those who testified against him, and the very foundation of the custody decisions surrounding Scout, Wiley, and Amelia. But there was a deeper, darker shift happening beneath the surface. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about vengeance. Drew wasn't interested in clearing his name. He wanted to bury his enemies. And the revelation about Curtis and Jacinda had given him permission to become ruthless. The way he once restrained himself, with Carly, with Willow, with Sonny, was gone. The mask had slipped. Now he had something they feared. Something undeniable. And with Kai quietly feeding him more intel, Drew's next moves would be calculated and merciless. The bomb hadn't gone off yet, but the fuse was lit. And everyone in Port Charles was about to feel the blast. Jordan Ashford had spent her life navigating through storms, personal, professional, emotional, with a calm steadiness that many mistook for detachment. But beneath her composed exterior, beneath the badge and the protocols, lay a woman who had been burned, betrayed, rebuilt, and refined by experience. She had seen enough of love to know how it could uplift or destroy, how it could heal or haunt. And Curtis? He was both her wound and her anchor. A man she had loved with her whole heart, then lost to a tide of miscommunications, secrets, and second chances that never quite arrived. For a long time, Jordan had forced herself to accept it, to swallow her own longing in silence as she watched him walk into a new life with Portia Robinson. But acceptance was not the same as peace. And lately, the facade she had constructed around that acceptance had begun to crack. It started with small things. The way Portia clung too tightly when speaking of her marriage. The overly scripted declarations about trust and healing, the subtle glances between her and Trina that always seemed loaded with some unspoken weight. Jordan noticed it all. She always noticed. At first, she told herself it was paranoia, a symptom of old feelings rising at the worst time. But the more she watched, the clearer it became, something was off. Something in Portia's version of love didn't feel real. And once that suspicion took root, it began to grow like ivy, wrapping itself around Jordan's every thought, every encounter. Every look exchanged in passing between Curtis and Portia that seemed more performative than genuine. And that suspicion, quiet at first, eventually gave way to something much more dangerous: hope. Not the soft kind of hope that gently heals old wounds, but the sharp, consuming kind that refuses to stay buried. It rose from the depths of Jordan's soul, uninvited but unstoppable. Whispering questions she had long ago silenced. What if you were right about her? What if Curtis still looks for you in the spaces she can't fill? What if your love never actually ended, just paused? The questions haunted her. And once she began to hope again, everything changed. Jordan found herself reanalyzing every moment she'd shared with Curtis since the wedding. Every conversation. Every glance, every unspoken pause. There was always something unsaid between them, always a tension that never dulled. And while Curtis tried to play the role of dutiful husband, Jordan could feel it. The uncertainty, the hesitation, the part of him that hadn't fully let her go. That small, persistent pull between them was no longer subtle. It was palpable. And it was terrifying. Because if Curtis still loved her, even in some quiet, conflicted way, then what did that say about everything he was trying to build with Portia? What did it say about the choices he had made? And worse, what if he knew things weren't right with Portia, but didn't know how to walk away? What if he needed someone to say the thing he couldn't say aloud? Jordan felt the weight of those questions pressing against her chest like a hand she couldn't push away. And then came the tipping point. A confidential source hinted to Jordan that Portia had been speaking to someone privately, someone she didn't want Curtis or Trina to know about. At first, Jordan chalked it up to personal business. Medical maybe. But when she quietly looked into it, the name that came up stopped her cold: Jacinda. The same woman who had vanished after being central to a questionable testimony months earlier.
A woman tied to the deception financial mess and the broader investigation that had ensnared Drew, Sonny, and others. And if Portia was in contact with her, the implications were staggering.
What if Portia had used Jacinda to protect Curtis? What if she had helped control the outcome of investigations, of custody hearings? Of Drew's defense strategy, just to shield her new husband from blowback? The more Jordan dug, the more plausible it became. And that's when suspicion turned into obsession. Because now it wasn't just about emotions. It was about ethics. About justice. About truth. Jordan wasn't just a woman in love anymore, she was a cop with a responsibility to uncover wrongdoing. And if Portia had crossed a line, Jordan would expose it. Even if it meant breaking Curtis's heart. Even if it meant reigniting something between them that neither of them was prepared for. But that potential, the idea that uncovering the truth might also restore something she had once lost, was a fire Jordan could no longer ignore. She found herself dreaming about Curtis again. Not the past version of him, but the man he was now. Stronger. Wiser. Still searching. She remembered how he used to look at her, not with possession, but with reverence. Like she was his compass. His calm in the chaos. And she remembered how that gaze had started to return, little by little, every time they crossed paths lately. The emotional pull was becoming harder to resist. Her doubts about Portia's sincerity were now coupled with a rekindled certainty about what she and Curtis had once shared. And as that certainty grew, so did the danger. Because feelings buried too long don't resurface quietly. They come back with force. With urgency. With fire. And so Jordan now stood on the precipice of something monumental. She was no longer just a spectator in Curtis's life, she was becoming a catalyst. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, she had stepped back into the narrative. The haunting wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was hope. A raw, relentless hope that the story of Jordan and Curtis wasn't over. That it was simply waiting for the right moment to begin again. But Portia wasn't going to give up her place easily. And Curtis? He was already caught between two truths, one comfortable, one unfinished. One public, one real. And Jordan? Jordan was ready to fight. Not out of desperation, but out of conviction. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just reacting. She was choosing. And what she chose was clear. To uncover the truth. To confront the lie. To reclaim the love. To stop hiding from the haunting, and finally walk into the storm. Kai stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on Curtis. His voice low but laced with urgency as he laid out the pieces of a puzzle that had finally started coming together, and what he revealed shook the foundation of everything Curtis thought he understood. The world around them felt like it had shifted, the air had grown heavier with each word Kai spoke. This wasn't just an update. This was a reckoning. A change was unfolding beneath their feet. And neither of them could afford to ignore it. Kai summarized the situation with clinical precision, but the implications were anything but sterile. Jacinda, the woman whose testimony had once felt like a distant complication, a footnote in the chaos, had become the epicenter of a storm. And it wasn't just about her past involvement with Drew's legal team or the financial underpinnings of the deception investigation. It was about what she was doing now. According to Kai's sources, Jacinda had resurfaced, and what she was saying, or being paid to say, had the power to tear apart everything Curtis had built since aligning himself with Portia and distancing himself from Jordan. From the truth, from himself. There had been whispers that Jacinda had accepted money. That she had falsified or manipulated portions of her original statements. That her withdrawal from the case had been less about fear and more about calculated silence. But now, those whispers were becoming screams, and Kai had the proof. Surveillance logs. Intercepted communications, and the beginnings of a paper trail that pointed to bribery, coercion, and betrayal. At the heart of it all, Portia's name, carefully redacted in some places. Explicitly mentioned in others. And suddenly, everything Curtis had tried to preserve, his marriage, his reputation, his moral clarity, was collapsing. Kai didn't gloat. He wasn't here to win. He was here because the truth had become too explosive to keep buried, and Curtis deserved to know just how deep the rot went. And Jacinda? She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't the confused, manipulated woman Curtis remembered. She had transformed into something else entirely, something wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. The decisions she had made, the people she had spoken to. The stories she was now telling, it all reeked of madness, desperation, and perhaps even revenge. The new madness sweeping through Port Charles wasn't just the result of lies, it was being fueled by Jacinda's unraveling. Her reappearance had become the match thrown into a room soaked in gasoline. Her statements had already reached the ears of the district attorney's office. The name-dropping had begun. The implications were spreading like fire. And now, every deal made in secret. Every protection offered behind closed doors, every favor Portia had quietly orchestrated was at risk of being exposed. Curtis listened, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He had thought aligning himself with Portia meant stability, control, healing. But Kai's revelations tore that illusion apart. It wasn't just about whether Jacinda was telling the truth, it was about why she had stayed quiet for so long, and what it meant that she was suddenly speaking again. The timing was too precise. The details were too specific. Someone had lit the fuse, and Jacinda was the spark. The transformation was undeniable. This was no longer the Port Charles Curtis knew. This was something darker. More volatile, a new chapter defined by shifting loyalties, weaponized truth, and a woman on the edge of reason dragging everyone with her into the chaos. Kai's summary wasn't just information. It was a warning. The madness had begun. And Jacinda wasn't done. Now Curtis had a choice, stand by and hope the damage could be contained, or step into the fire, confront the unraveling. And finally admit that the story he thought he was living had never been real. Because in this new version of the truth, there were no innocent bystanders. Only survivors, and casualties.